Joe. I just want to say, I'm on the wireless. I just want to say that it's not just usability folks. It's been user experience designers, really a whole range of people, including good government advocates who've kind of taken up the cause of, well, what we might call service design as part of elections. But today I want to talk to you about something a little bit different, which is writing great persona stories. A little bit about me that Joe didn't mention. I have a past life as a theater designer, and I got into the whole idea of storytelling as a way of communicating the user research that we did. And I want to also, in absentia, introduce Kevin Brooks, who's the co-author on the first book I wrote, Storytelling for User Experience. He kind of was the other half of me because he is a performance storyteller. I write, he performs. He does sort of innovative experience design. I do research. So together we kind of covered the field. And he taught me an awful lot. There are bits of things that he taught me all the way through this presentation. And I just want to ask everybody to send out good wishes to him. He's in the hospital right now. I've been listening to conversations here, and I was interested yesterday at the first talk in the networking, the first question in the networking lunch, at how diverse this crowd is. And that's really great. Because to me, one of the challenges in UX is it's nice to be in your own little huddle with people who do exactly what you do, but that's not how we work, right? We work by having to communicate across disciplines. And I think that personas can be part of that, and the stories they tell can be part of that, because personas connect us to the one group of people who is most often not in the room when we actually sit down to do our work. No matter how much research we've done, it's really hard to remember people who aren't like us and who have different challenges, different ideas about what that product might be, and keep them in mind when we're busy doing our own project. Stories, I think, are, for me, inextricably mixed with personas. Right? Stories are what makes personas, not just data. Right? If we just wanted to do demographic data and task analysis, we wouldn't need personas. We have really good tools for that stuff. What stories do is add ways of transmitting knowledge in an effective way, of conveying emotion, and help us share information in a memorable form. When I started working in this field about years ago, if we had a little tiny paragraph on who the users were, we were lucky. Now, I can walk into a project and have a stack of paper like this that's the research reports for the last year. When I did some personas for National Cancer Institute, they had done something like 50 or 60 research studies that year across the organization. And they had market research data, and they had their web analytics data, and they had their web intercepts data. And the challenge here wasn't finding out about users, it was avoiding drowning in the detail, drowning in the amount of information. So I think personas help us balance those two things. Stories do one other thing, which is that they create relationships. When we think about storytelling, we usually think about the storyteller. Or maybe we think about the story. But the real important thing that happens is that, first of all, there's a relationship between the storyteller and the story they choose to tell. There's a relationship between the story and how it's heard by the people who listen to it. But most importantly, stories create the bottom line of that triangle. Right? They create the relationship between the storyteller and the story listeners. Right? They create that feedback loop. As UX researchers, we actually do a double loop, right? Because we create a triangle between us and the people we research, right? And the users that we research. And then we bring that story back, and we create a triangle between the stories we heard and the things we bring back to talk to our developers about. And the whole point of that is to create a third triangle that connects the people working on the product team, all of us, with the people out there we're working for, and make that connection, even if they haven't been able to be part of that research, even if they came in late to the project or don't get sent out. That's one of the things that stories can do, is bring that together. And one of the reasons that's important is because a story can be shared in an emotional way that facts and details and I love the stuff on the walls. I live and die by Post-it notes, right? But in the end, Post-it notes are a means to an end. This is just a quick story that's actually a personal story. I was in London. I was visiting friends who live about an hour outside of London, and I decided to go in to see a play because I used to work in theater, love to see theater. And they gave me instructions about how to get home, I think as though I'd never seen a transit system or a city before. They were telling night buses and which stop it was and how I had to be there. And they said, really, watch the train times, because after 9 o'clock, there's only 2 trains an hour. Now, they heard this as a big disaster and a failure of the British rail system because they're used to, having really minimal waits. But I live in a place where there are 2 buses after 9 o'clock and one is at 12:30 in the morning, right? So I heard, wow, 2 trains an hour, how amazing, right? How wonderful that is. So same fact, 2 completely different reactions to it. Probably some more reactions from other people. Don't like trains, do like trains, night buses are crazy. And stories can help you bring all of those things together by not just communicating the fact, but adding to it with what the meaning of that fact is to the people hearing it. Because maybe it's not the same for the entire audience. Maybe it is. But that's one of the things you can do, is convey the emotion and the meaning assigned to that information. There are tons of ways to use stories. And they're really building blocks. They're not an end in themselves. Just like a persona is not an end in itself. A persona is a means to an end. Stories are a means to the end. So one of the things you could do with them, for example, is to think about communicating patterns of use. This is a little snippet from a report at National Cancer Institute that I worked on. You're going to hear a lot of examples from a couple of government projects I did because I can. So they're not the only things I worked on, but they're the things I can share. We were having all this problem with users cycling in kind of circular navigation patterns through the site. And it didn't seem to matter what kind of content it was. It wasn't a particular path. And we couldn't figure it out until we suddenly realized what was happening about how the links on the page were placed, because the content people had very carefully cross-referenced everything to everything. So if you started from treatment, it would take you to prevention, and it would take you from overview to detail. And people were looping back through that, thinking they were going deeper into the data when actually they were going back up to a beginning point. And we could tell that story about one piece of content, but what we realized is that it was a pervasive pattern. And so we started doing little bits of pieces at the end of the usability test reports, sort of saying, well, here's kind of what's happening, and here's an example of this loop, right? We've started from something, we've searched for something else, that's taken us to a best bets. We've gone into the detailed choice, and then it's taken us right back to best bets, right? And so we could begin to show people what was happening, and also in our sessions begin to delve down more into why people were making those choices. Because it was good to have those links, but maybe they were in the wrong place on the screen, right? So we could begin to think about what those patterns were and what that story was. And one of the stories that we discovered was that it was really about trying to make sure you didn't miss anything, right? So you have to be clear about things like consistent link labeling. Another book from Rosenfeld Media that I just adore is called See What I Mean. It's from Kevin Chang. It's on using cartoons and comics for communicating design patterns. And one of the things that comics let you do is talk about time, right? It lets you show thought, and it lets you show action over time. And I think that's when people complain about wireframes being too static, one of the things they're saying is that I can't see the dynamic action in the sequence of screens, because the connections between those screens is not really click, it's really thought, intention, click, right? And so how do you communicate that? And Kevin claims that even if you can't draw, you can do this. I've tried. I actually have done it. I would never share them, but this is somebody else's drawing. But I do think that thinking about it in terms of a comic, thinking about a line of what's happening on the screen, a line of what's happening in someone's head, and a line about what's happening between the screens is actually an important thing to think about. And we can either draw stories or write stories that do that. We can also think about how we use those stories in our design, right? Now, it might be that you're working on a product where a kind of storytelling approach can be very obvious in the interface, but that's not always true. This is a screen from the National Cancer Institute page on adolescents and young adults with cancer. They have a lot of what they call portals on the site that take a particular audience into the cancer information they need. Now, let's be clear. No one comes to the National Cancer Institute and thinks, oh, goody, I'm going to read about cancer today. Right? People come to sites like NCI because something bad has happened in their lives. or someone's lives they know, or they're worried about something, right? They're not coming here for fun. So we're not going to do cartoons and cute stuff here. But we did want to think about the journey. Now, in the medical profession, they think about things like prevention and symptoms and diagnosis and treatment, and you can see how that's a kind of logical progression. And the site was set up that way. The person in charge of it said, there's something wrong with this, and I don't quite know what it is, and I'd like to figure it out. And we did a lot of work with people who were cancer survivors as young adults. And they said, I come to this site because I've just been diagnosed, and the first thing you tell me about is prevention? Wrong story, right? And so even though this probably, from the distance, if you don't read it carefully, looks like just any other portal site, a couple of pictures, a headline, a few links, right? A little bit of text to help you know what you're doing. But there's a careful journey built into here about the basic facts and what do you do now? And things like down at the bottom, survivorship comes above what happens when treatment isn't working. Because cancer is this constant balance between fear and hope, right? Between good days and bad days. And you want to have the good days before you have the bad days. So thinking about that story and making sure that that's reflected in the IA of the site. They did a lot of work with the pictures. First they said, these people are all too healthy. And then they said, these people are all too sick looking. And they had to find a balance between people who looked like they could be the readers, but weren't depressing, right? Weren't false hope, weren't depressing. Finding that balance to help people weave through that situation. Now, maybe your site isn't quite that dire as cancer information, but we're always weaving through hopes and desires and fears, right? We're always weaving through, do I have enough money to spend this? Maybe not, can I spend it now? Or should I make this choice? Should I buy these shoes? Right? Those are all always about balancing. And understanding those stories can help you understand what you're balancing. Whoops. You can also use stories with personas to fill in details. Caroline Jarrett and I did personas for the Open University. It's the largest university in Europe. It's largely distance learning. And we made an interesting decision about our personas, which is that rather than our personas representing a state, right, a type of person, they represented people who were in education for different reasons, and the personas had a full journey. So we had stories for those personas from the first time they started thinking about higher education, their first contact with the OU, all the way through their career. So we had Jason, who's the kid who went to college right after high school. We had Rachel, who's the person who went off to the city to work and have a good time, and now she's in her 20s and kind of settling down. But we could have a 70-year-old Rachel, right? Someone who was Rachel, and we could see that progression. We could think about, again, that academic journey and how the Open University fits into her life. Because if you go back to university and you didn't just get shipped off there by your parents, it's a big life choice. You're either there because you're worried about your job or because there's a huge aspiration behind that. And how do we help meet all the different people and all the different reasons they're in higher education on the site? Because as a distance learning university, that website is their admissions office, right? It is where people go to register. It's where people meet it for the first time. And being able to do those stories. And as we worked on new sections of the site, we would add more stories. So that instead of inventing new personas, we kept filling in the stories. We added some over time, some disappeared over time, but we kept looking at every time we met somebody live. We would think about who they were, and we would think about what little piece of anecdote or piece of their story could be added to that bigger story we were building for the personas, so that instead of the personas fragmenting over time, they got deeper and richer. And we would ask new teams to write their own stories for the personas. We'd ask them to be the personas and look at their own section of the site through those eyes. And so what we hoped was that they would become a consolidating factor. Instead of something that we owned and protected, they became something that everybody could own a little bit. And we put up with some little variations on the edges because that was okay. The most important thing was that people were beginning to engage with the idea of people who weren't already knowledgeable about higher education, already ready and with well-formed plans. We could think about how you change someone from someone with a vague aspiration to someone with a goal for a qualification. And the other thing that we can do with stories is reveal unexpected data. If any of you work in healthcare, nurses are generally not considered very technology forward, right? They tended to go into their profession because they liked working with people. So they didn't become a lab tech or a specialized piece of equipment operator. They became a nurse because they deal day-to-day with humans. And this was in 2008 or so, and they were definitely not early adopters of smartphones. And NCI was beginning to think about smartphone apps or what information should be on mobile devices for this very, very large site. And we were testing a few comps of ideas. They were really just very suggestive kind of drawings to get people to react to the idea itself. And we almost left that section out of the nurses' sessions because we know mostly they didn't have smartphones. We actually confirmed this. We'd start by asking about their technology, and they'd say, don't have a smartphone. No, just regular phone's good enough for me. I have all this other stuff I deal with. I'm fine. And one day, we just decided to leave it in. And I'm glad we did, because several of the people looked at something. One of the ideas was to take the Spanish-English cancer terms dictionary and put it on a mobile format. And a nurse we called Gina looked at this and went, I could have this in my pocket. I've learned conversational Spanish, but I want to get the medical terms right. I could use this to talk to my patients. Where do I buy one? Right? Now, we thought, okay, it's a one-off, but we started hearing that sort of story again, with people beginning to think, what could this little thing do, that would change my life for the better and not just be another piece of stuff I have to deal with? And so the IA team immediately began working on plans, because at NCI, a year and a half would be a really, really fast project. And we figured if we started now, we'd sort of meet the curve. And indeed, when we did the first mobile testing of the very first prototype of the mobile HTML5 apps, we had to pry people away from reading. Now, this does not happen much in our sessions, right? But people were really engaged in it. And they were engaged in it not just because we took big stuff and slammed it down into a little screen, but because the content strategy folks had worked really hard on thinking about what people read on a mobile device, what information they needed, how did it fit into that story, how do we shorten it, what goes at the top, what do we link to the big site for, what kinds of information do people need in their pocket today. So all of that research and all those stories kind of came together in a plan for how we write information that was kind of groundbreaking for them. Another thing that you can do with stories and your personas is you can really think about the dreams that people bring to things. Or you can think about the unusual stories and how you reveal them to your team. The picture is actually from my theater life. It's a one-woman opera of a woman in the moment between alive and dead, and her life, and thinking back through her life in song, of course. So we know that personas embody data, right? Good personas are based in reality. They're not just made up. They're not just stories. So let's just think about two personas here. We've got Maria. She's a community health worker. She's married with grown kids. She's a smartphone user, and I think I actually have the wrong persona up. I think Jacob is the one I want. So I'm going to tell you about Jacob, even though you're looking at Emily. Jacob is a paralegal. He's a real equipment geek. He's kind of the first guy to ever buy every new device. Really loves the stuff. He's one of these born digital guys. So let's look at their personas. Yep. So Maria turns out to be bilingual. She's actually works in the Latino community in LA. She's a community health worker, which means that she's not a medical professional, but she's the intermediary. She's helping a large Spanish-speaking community understand the medical system in the U.S. And she loves having all this stuff in her pocket and loves being able to carry it around. She's not real technology forward, it turns out, and she's still pretty bilingual. Right? So we could think about what we need to do to make sure that this information works for her. And if you think that this is just a transitional problem or only a problem if you're selling into the Spanish community, there are 17.8 million people in the United States, according to the census, who speak English less than well. That doesn't mean they don't speak English. It doesn't mean they don't read English. It just means that they're not fluent in it and they struggle with it. So if you make the information easier to read, you've made it more usable for them. The other thing that we know from market research, and the reason why Maria, this particular character, is Latino, is that Latinos use mobile devices as their first computer more often. So we're baking research data into here, but we're also baking stories we heard from people when we were doing research in LA. And if we look at Jacob, I'm kind of surprised for Jacob is that Jacob actually is blind. Oh, now how much did that change your idea about who Jacob is? Right? What do we need to do to make sure that Jacob, our equipment geek, our paralegal, lots of reading, lots of writing, what do we need to do to help him use our products better? So we can add that by not making the blind persona, but making the paralegal who happens to be blind. Now, maybe you don't think there's a lot of blind people in your audience, but what there are in your audience, and I can guarantee it, is a lot of people with vision problems. Maybe they're just old. Maybe they're like me and they hit bifocal era and I'm constantly switching glasses to get the right distance to my computer. So when we add that, it becomes a much larger population. And we might think about whether that really cute small text that fits on our big, giant, wonderful-looking screen in our perfectly lit offices is actually the right size text. We can think about making sure there's no one who's not working with style sheets anymore, is there? Right? Making sure that we've got style sheets that are flexible so that if I need it bigger or they need a special contrast or they need to make the screen brighter or darker, that people can do that. So now we can talk about meeting people where they are, not having to design 1,400 variations, but allowing them to use their own tools. So Jacob happens to be fluent in Braille, but really only about 10% of people who are blind are fluent in Braille. So you can't just say I slapped a Braille label on my button and I've solved the whole problem. Right? We have to think about the many ways that people interact with devices and making sure that they accommodate more than one sense. And so now all of a sudden we've kind of wrapped thinking about accessibility into our design thinking rather than making it a technical compliance problem. Right? So what happens when you do that is that compliance gets a lot easier. So if you're struggling with 508 or you're struggling with meeting the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, that all gets easier if you've thought about flexibility from the beginning, because nothing works very well when you have to add it at the last minute after the design is done. In the new book, we've got 8 personas of different people who use the web in different ways. They're also available online. We're introducing one every Tuesday morning until they're all online at the book site at Rosenfeld Media. So if you're interested, they're out there. We encourage you to use them either intact or adapt pieces of them and build them into your own personas so that we can think about a larger audience. Because if you didn't include them in your design thinking at the beginning, they're not going to be included in your design at the end or in your product at the end. So the real key to making what we call a web for everyone is thinking about everyone at the beginning. Sounds a little more complicated, sounds like a little overwhelming, but not so much when you get started. So I want to think a little bit about how we tell the story. Right? The classic argument about persona stories is whether they should be in third person, that is told by the researcher, or whether they should be in first person, that is told by the persona. Anybody have opinions on this? Who writes for their personas in third person? Who writes personas at all? Ooh, a much smaller set of hands than I'd hoped. Well, first of all, I hope that this convinces you that maybe there's a way that you should be doing this. Let me back up a sec and just say that personas does not have to be a whole separate project, right? I don't like projects where they say, let's go build personas. I like projects where they say, we've been doing all this great research. Let's think about how we can put them together into personas. It's a very different question. And I do a lot of what we call assumption personas. Tamara Adlin invented the phrase, which is writing personas with no particular research data at all. Ooh, sounds like heresy, right? But here's the secret. Those ghosts are in the room with you. When you sit down at your table with your design team or your product team, those people are in the room. So when you get them to write assumption personas, when you work with them to develop a set of personas of who you think you're designing for, what you're doing is making those ghosts visible. Now sometimes things happen like this. someone I was working with in a workshop called me up a week later, and he said, well, I did what you said. We went home, we wrote assumption personas, and then I took them to our salespeople who were out in the field with our, trying to introduce our brand new product. And they said, who the hell are these people? We don't meet any of these people in our travels. What's going on here? What do you mean you're designing for people like this? Now, that's a pretty big crisis in a startup. And isn't it nice that they had that crisis before they finished the product, right? Because that's when the conversation needs to happen, right? So just creating personas out of the heads of the people in the room can surface user research gaps. They can surface design research gaps. Or you might find out that they actually know their audience pretty well at all. Open University started like that. In my absence, they all sat down and wrote a bunch of about 8 personas that they thought represented their students. And I looked at them and I went, well, we'll have to do a little research about that. We'll see how that went. And then we did a couple of days of some testing of something we were working on. And we recruited for that testing with the following extremely strict recruiting criteria. We called up people who happened to be on the student or recently enrolled list, and we said, hello, I understand you live near Milton Keynes. Do you think you could come in on Tuesday morning? And that was the entire recruiting process. It was random. It was people who happened to live within hailing distance of the place where we were going to be, and were they free on Tuesday and Wednesday? And at the end of that day, we sat down and we said, well, who are these personas? And I could, having never met an OU student or thought about British higher education very much, and not having helped write the personas, I could identify the personas that those participants fit into. And that was when I stopped telling them that they didn't know their audience. They knew their audience pretty well. What they didn't know how to do was make use of that knowledge to design for that audience. So it was just overwhelming. Every department insisted that their students were different and special, when in fact, there were students studying for all kinds of reasons in all of the departments. And so now we knew what those personas needed to do. They needed to be a way for us to bring together all the knowledge that people in a university have of their students into how we design, in this case, the course catalog and the registration process and the get-to-know-you process, the admissions process. So whether you have personas you're working with or are just starting out on a journey of a way of thinking about your users, if you're doing Agile and you're using user stories, you can think of the users in Agile stories as the thinnest of stick figures. And personas is how you hang the clothes on them, how you flesh them out, how you take them from wireframes to human and add the pieces about them. Now, I was teaching personas in China, and 3 women came up to me at the break, having very carefully prepared their question, and they said, if you're going to design for personas, doesn't that mean they have to be really, really right? And I said, yeah. I mean, if you create personas that are counterintuitive, or you create personas that are based on very thin data or what you hope your users will be like, then, yeah, you're going to be designing the wrong product. But if you're constantly using the personas as a way of decking what you're thinking about users against what you're seeing in the field, what you're seeing when you talk to stakeholders, what you're seeing when you go out and do some quick usability testing, then they become a way of keeping you on course. So let's think about how we write those stories and how we let those users tell their stories. If you write in third person, you're essentially writing an authoritative tale, right? John Van Manen, who has a wonderful book on social research called Tales of the Field, talks about 3 types of stories that can come out of ethnography. And this one he calls the realist tale. That is, you're making a claim to authority and authenticity about the story. But something else happens when you write in third person. You can also the story can act as intermediary, because you can weave in the language that Mary, our community nurse, uses, but you can also match that with the language the team uses. So you can think about a patient, how they refer to a problem, and you can think about how the medical professionals refer to the same thing. And you can begin to bridge the language gaps and the perception gaps and show what Mary's thinking and how that fits into the larger picture the team might be thinking. Right? And when you do this, you're really invoking your research authority. Right? You're invoking the clarity of the research you've done. So you have to kind of be careful about that. You don't want to write a story that has "it depends" in every sentence, but you also don't want to be too incredibly definitive if you're not sure, because being not sure is part of the research life, and you want to make sure that you have communicated that. Another way to think about it is in second person. Now, this is actually the least used in personas that I've seen, but Caroline did this with the OU. A couple of years ago, the UK changed its funding scheme for higher education completely. It really changed many, many things about how people were going to get funding to go to university, how they were thinking about university, and because of the unique nature of the Open University, it changed the OU's relationship with potential students. And so she conducted a series of what she called interviews with the personas. And she asked them questions about how they were going to pay for their education. And she asked them questions about what they were thinking. Were they planning this to be full-time or part-time? And how were they thinking about their education? And was this changed? And she created a very simple series of sort of Q&As. Now, this was a mature set of personas. We knew them pretty well. But you could see doing that live. Maybe you're the user researcher for your team. I see at least one standing in the back of the room. And during a design session, maybe you aren't there as a designer. Maybe you're there to be the voice of the users, to be able to kind of on the spot think through that big memory bank you have of all the people you've talked to and observed and listened to, and to be able to say, well, if you did it that way, I think if I was Mary, this might happen. On the other hand, Gina might love this. So to be able to channel that voice, or to let them ask you questions in the person of those personas. It's called informants. Right? It lets you sort of enact that persona even if that person isn't there. And now you're really writing a story that's in second person, right? Because you're working, in the researcher side of you is talking to that person, and you're having a conversation. So you've got those two going on. And when you write a persona in first person, you're really inviting identity, right? You're representing the perspective of that persona. Now, most often I see this done interspersed with third person, right? It's really hard to write a whole set of personas in first person because the voice gets mixed up, especially if you're talking about them all at once. I who? Are you I Mary? Are you I Gina? Are you I Rachel? Or are you I Jason? Right? So being able to go back and forth, just like we intersperse direct quotes in research material, and research reports, you can begin to think about, here's the thing we're working on, that's third person. I wonder what Rachel would say. That takes us into second person, and now we can answer that question in Rachel's voice, in snippets. And we can do that when we do it using her own language, using her own way of expressing herself. One of the earliest projects I worked on was an early hypertext, a pre-web hypertext program for Hewlett-Packard when they introduced the new what was then new laser jets. And one of the things we didn't have in it was an index or search because they had font sizes for the first time. You could actually change the size of the font. And we had no idea what people thought this was. One of the people we worked with said, I'm trying to figure out how I squish the page. I don't know how we would let someone search for squish the page, and they certainly weren't searching for scale text to fit page. Right? So we had a real interesting language problem, and interspersing that language into what we talked about really helped, right? Because we could think about all the language that we take for granted, right? The minute you learn font and scale and all those words, they become English to you. At the OU, every university has a lot of specialized language. And we were wondering about how long it took a student to become an insider. And so we started working with people halfway through their first course, backing up to people who had just registered. And what we discovered was that students became insiders somewhere between the day they registered and the day they turned in their first assignment. Because by the time they turned in their first assignment, they'd really done they'd been through registration, they'd met their tutor, they'd gotten their course materials, they'd done their first online work, and they'd figured out how to use the assignment submission process. And that meant that 2 weeks into most courses, they'd become insiders. So when we were talking to people, say 3 months into a 6-month course, we were talking to old hands. And we weren't getting a fresh student perspective, even though it sounds pretty fresh. I'm in my first course. And so we started thinking about when that vocabulary shifted, when they became people who could rattle off the OU vocabulary, and when they were people who couldn't and for whom things were kind of meaningless. So, to wrap up, when we think about personas, users are like a big school of fish. At a distance, they might look alike, but actually they're all individuals. And one of the things that personas and their stories can give us is a richer understanding of the content, whether that's interactive content or textual content or image content. We can think about innovating from their real needs, and we can actually explore those in stories, right? We could have taken that story about Gina thinking about the smartphone for the first time, and we could then write a story that projected that out and talked about how she would actually use it and begin to think about that spark of an idea. We can use them to make our own ideas more persuasive. Instead of rushing in with a great technological idea or a cool design widget we've thought of, we can come in and ground that idea in a user context. Now, that's sort of cool stuff to do from a UX perspective, but when you think about making that case to business people, when you've grounded it in real people, you've also grounded it in bodies who might use or buy the product. And so you're connecting it to that ultimate business goal of having people want and desire the product in the first place. And most of all, we're keeping people in the center of our process. It's really easy to get caught up in our own tools and techniques and problems and challenges, but ultimately, our goal as designers is to hide all of that and make the thing we're there to do, right? When I order a taxi from Uber, I really don't care about the matrix and how they talk to their drivers. What I care about is how easy it is and how reliable it is to use this app to call a taxi, right? Because if I'm going to call a taxi at the last second, I have to know someone's going to show up. Otherwise, I better book Super Shuttle, right? So how do we adapt to that and make sure that we're keeping that context of use in the middle of our thoughts? There's a reason why philanthropic appeals put pictures on the screen. That picture of that really cute kid, a version of him appears on a lot of philanthropy sites and appeals, and it's because they work, right? It's because seeing those eyes and that cute face and that yearning looking out at the screen for you makes people want to connect. Just wanting to connect isn't good enough. We have to connect to that story, because this appeal might be about sanitation for orphans in Sierra Leone, but it might be about something completely different. And the story is what connects that emotional tug of another human being to the action we want someone to take, whether that's opening their wallet or tapping on something. We can't empathize with it until we know the story. There's been some interesting research on how to write stories for philanthropy. And they discovered that making appeals for how many thousands of kids there are out there who need this doesn't work very well. Numbers don't persuade. That individual story is the hook that lets you persuade. And then you can say, and I'd be helping lots of other people like this kid. Stories can also change how we think, right? Telling ourselves a story is to change how we think about the situation. Timothy Wilson has a book called Redirect that I think is wonderful. He's also got some good videos out that are good talks on the topic, if you just want to kind of see what it's about. He's a behavioral psychologist, so he's thinking about things like personal transformation. How do you change the way people think about themselves through creating a story? One of the projects they did looked at how you can help teenagers who are at risk of not graduating from high school make it through high school. And one of the things you could do is get them to volunteer. Now, when you're thinking about inner city poverty areas, the thought of asking people to volunteer sounds a little counterintuitive. But it turned out that by volunteering on something, and it didn't have to be a lot of time, they gave them this sense of their self-worth in the community. They became someone in their own minds who was valuable in the community and valuable in and of themselves. And that was often enough to get them through that hump of whatever was a problem in high school. The other thing they did was look at students who'd made it to college, but who were having a bad first semester and were at risk of dropping out. And they wanted to think about how they could change that mental story from, maybe I'm just not university material, this isn't going to work for me, to if I persist, I can see through it. And they did it by bringing in people who themselves had been through that process and having them be coaches. And then they thought about how they could distill that story and use a set of tools to change the little person that sits on our shoulder and talks in our ear, and change that person from saying, drop out, drop out, drop out, you can't do it, to saying, hang in there, you can persist. So the story we tell changes how we think. And if any of you are wearing Fitbits or Nike Fuel Bands or any of those things, all of those exercise devices, which are really about getting us all to move more, right, are about giving you that little push that says, hey, 1,500 more steps and you made your goal for the day. Can we make that into a story that pushes people along? Now, I'm not really talking about story-centered design. This isn't a whole new process or anything. It's because everything we do is already inside it, right? When we go out and do research, we are gathering stories. When we sit there and do analysis, we are looking for story patterns. Ethnographers talk about cultures as people who share stories. Design is writing a story, and usability testing is presenting someone a story without an ending and asking them to end it, right? Will this story end in tears or happiness? So the stories you write are successful when three things are true. When they're based on real data, when they're the stories you want told. If you tell bad stories or stories about how users are dumb, then that's the lesson people learn. If you tell stories about how users figure things out and what they're doing, then you're telling a different story to your team. They're successful when they generate insights and empathy that lead to action, whether that action is user's action or designer's action, right? That action could be how we design the site. So think carefully about the stories you create and make them the stories you want your team to retell. Thank you.